Yes, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this rainy and gray September evening. My name's Nora Dufalo. I am the program director here at Tin Mountain Conservation Center. And before I hand things over to tonight's speaker, I want to take a moment to first thank Tin Mountain's Nature Program Series sponsors. Those are White Mountain Oil and Propane, Ragged Mountain Equipment, and Hancock Lumber. I additionally want to thank friends of the Whitney Community Center in Jackson, who are this program's special sponsor. So thank all of you for that support that allows us to continue with our nature programs. And I want to thank all of you watching who are current members of Tin Mountain Conservation Center. All of your membership dollars go towards helping us fulfill our mission, including putting on programs such as this. So thank you. And I will say, if you are watching and you are not currently a member of Tin Mountain, there is no better time to join than the month of September. September is new member month at Tin Mountain. And signing up this month, you can get $10 off. $10 off any whatever membership level works for you, as well as only new members are being entered into a raffle for some fantastic prizes, including a hydro flask and a mug, a Tin Mountain mug made by, and I know Russ is listening right now, made by With These Hands Pottery, the local potter, Jenny Blair. So lots of great prizes. If you're not a member, you can check out more of that on our website, tinmountain.org. A few upcoming programs that we do have. This Saturday, we are hosting a hawk watch north of the Notch. We are heading up to Weeks State Park in Lancaster, New Hampshire. They have recently rebuilt a viewing platform on the top of their hill. It is supposed to be a wonderful place for viewing this fall hawk migration. So we're excited to host that program this Saturday. You can register for that on our website if you're interested. And then the following Saturday, October 1st, we are very excited to welcome back Sandy McDermott, who was a Valley resident and is currently residing with her husband in Alaska, but comes back periodically. And every time she does, we like to tap into her fabulous artistic skills. She will be hosting a wildlife sketching program. This one will be focused on drawing birds. So that program is Saturday morning, October 1st. So some interesting programs we have coming up. I will say when we scheduled the program for this evening with Wendy, it was one of those programs that it was like, I wish this program sounded great. But the thought of, spongy moth and other invasive insects sounds like a very overwhelming and potentially depressing topic, but the point, that is not the intention. The intention is, it's something that has been around, certainly the spongy moth we've seen the past 2 summers. There are other invasive insects, and really the best thing that we can do is educate ourselves about them, about how they travel and any methods we can do to prevent them. So we are so happy to have Wendy Scribner here with us. She works for UNH Cooperative Extension out of Carroll County as their forester. And before I hand things over to Wendy, I will just say, because it's been a while since we've hosted a virtual program, that if you have a question during the program, I would encourage you to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring that chat, and if it's an immediate clarifying question, I will pop in and ask that of Wendy Otherwise, I will wait and read through those at the end of her program. And I think most of you were muted on entry, and I would just encourage you to keep yourselves muted as well so that we don't pick up any unintended background noise. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Wendy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nora. I'm really excited to see that many people out there interested in gypsy moth or spongy moth. Unfortunately, that probably means that you've seen quite a bit of defoliation locally in your neighborhood. But with that, let me start sharing my screen and we'll start talking about, let's see, Nora, do you have the,
yes,
are you seeing the slideshow? Okay, perfect.
We are seeing it as we should. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. So yeah, Nora had asked me to talk about the gypsy moth and what's been happening here in the Mount Washington Valley. And I should apologize up front. I have been talking about this insect and calling it the gypsy moth since about the 80s, when that was the first infestation that I really noticed and was aware of. And they have changed the name. It is no longer officially referred to as the gypsy moth. The Entomological Society of America has changed the name to spongy moth. And the spongy reference really refers to the egg masses that the females lay. They actually take fur from their belly and they insulate those eggs in this kind of squishy, spongy egg mass that they then deposit typically on trees, but also on cars, on yard furniture, anywhere they happen to complete their mating and leave those egg masses. So there we go. Okay. So very localized. 2021, you can see here some pictures of the mountain range just east of the north-south road. So you're looking sort of past Pudding Pond area, and you can see the whole hillside here. This is really a sandy, dry site, really a typical site where you would tend to find red oak, which is the preferred species of the spongy moth. Again, its Latin name is Lymantria dispar. I apologize for the number of times I will probably call it gypsy moth throughout the show, throughout the presentation. I'll try to correct myself as we go along. But this was some of the damage or defoliation that we saw in 2001. Following year, this is an aerial view of the Conway area. You can see these areas throughout where you have all of this defoliation. Again, most of our defoliation tends to happen in places where we have a good component of oak. Oak is really one of the favored species of the gypsy moth, spongy moth. So where did it come from? This fellow, Etienne Trouvelot, back in the 1860s, was interested in breeding hybrid silkworms that would be hardier than the typical traditional Chinese silkworms. Apparently at this point in time, there were some diseases in the silkworms. This is also around the time of the Civil War, and cotton was a challenge to get. So this idea, there were a number of people interested in this idea of raising hardy silkworms. So he brought a bunch of gypsy moths, that's what they were called at that time, into where he lived in Medford, Mass. He raised a whole bunch of them, and unfortunately some of them escaped into the landscape in 1869. He did report this escape, and from that time forward, we have been trying to control this insect. By 1881, they were a nuisance in the local neighborhood he was in, and then by 1889, the population just exploded. I love this historical picture here, just shows you how the techniques were different. You know, you've got this rickety old ladder, no safety features whatsoever. But you can see the people here on a property in Malden trying to find and destroy all of the egg masses in an effort to eradicate this insect. Through all of the eradication efforts that they tried throughout the late 1800s. They believed they were successful. But then in 1905, there was another huge outbreak. And what we know about this insect now is that we have these, it's really a cyclical nature of the population. It will be a very low population for a number of years, and then we'll have several years in a row where the population just explodes, and it's 10 to hundreds of times higher population levels. Early on, they did try to use pesticides to control the insects, chemicals like Paris green and lead arsenate. They were not particularly effective in controlling gypsy moths. Some of that may have been related to just the tools that they had to apply the chemicals. This just really staggers my mind when they described the successful efforts they had in controlling gypsy moth numbers by banding trees, using burlap and creating these burlap traps, basically, where they fold the top of the burlap over. Gypsy moths are going up and down the tree. They're typically feeding at night early on in the infestation, and they'll come down and they'll get into the shade in shelter during the day. And so people can come back and you can clear out those gypsy moth caterpillars that are there. They wrapped 2.5 million trees in these burlap traps and had 570 men revisiting them every day to collect and destroy the caterpillars that they found hiding there. And when you think about the feeding time for the gypsy moth, it's about an 8-week time frame. So just think about the effort that went into trying to control these insects by hand back in the late 1800s. Moving up into the 1940s and 50s, DDT was used to control gypsy moth, and it was quite effective. Unfortunately, we all know the downsides of DDT now. And so as it started to be detected in food and in feedstocks, they did discontinue the use of it. And despite all of those efforts at trying to eradicate the insect, it's continued to spread. And you can see from this chart here, Eastern Massachusetts, Southern New Hampshire, really early in the infestation, early 1900s, first started seeing our first waves of gypsy moth infestation. Here in Carroll County, probably around the 1920s is when we started to see the first infestations. The real challenge with gypsy moth is that they feed on so many different species. They can feed on about 300 or more different plant species. Some of the most susceptible species are, of course, our oaks, alder, apple, aspen, gray and white birch. These are the species that they'll go after first. Then there's a whole category of resistant species. So these are species that are not really their first choice. In some cases, the caterpillars cannot eat these leaves when they're really small. There's an issue with digestion. But later on, as they get older, they can feed on beech, black and yellow birch, hemlock, maples, pine, spruce. And so it's interesting to have an insect that will feed on both hardwoods and softwoods. And then we have a series of immune species that the caterpillars rarely feed on, and that includes arborvitae, ash, fir, black locust. But actually, it's interesting to see a lot of what I'm seeing for defoliation. I'm seeing some pine and spruce and hemlock underneath overstory oak trees that have been completely defoliated as these caterpillars finish feeding on the oak. They drop down, end up in those conifer stands, and heavy feeding in the conifer stands unfortunately does lead to mortality for those trees. So just to talk briefly about the life cycle, what we see for the most part of the year are these egg masses that we see primarily on trees, but again on other surfaces. And that's part of the reason, or part of the way the population can spread if you move yard furniture that has these egg masses on it. Some of these egg masses end up, on cars that then are moving to different locations. And that's part of how this insect spreads around. The egg masses are present for about 9 months. The females lay these masses of 300 to 500 eggs in each egg mass. The fur, they use fur from their belly to insulate and protect those eggs. And then those eggs are going to begin hatching out in May. Unfortunately, it's a little bit blurry, but here are some of the caterpillars just emerging from the egg mass. And you can see just up at the top here, I don't know whether you can see my pointer or not, but there's a little piece of the pupal case that the caterpillar transformed from a caterpillar into a moth. The female moths don't fly, actually, so they very often will mate and lay their eggs, their egg mass, within a couple of inches of where they emerged from these pupal cases. And then here's another picture of a very young caterpillar. At first, they're this brownish black color. When they're first born, they start out at about 1/16 of an inch long. And by the time they're done feeding 8 weeks later, they may be over 3 inches long. And I found this statistic that really kind of surprised me, that each caterpillar can consume up to 12 square feet of foliage during this time. This is the time that they're feeding as a caterpillar. So when you think about just how many caterpillars are out there, each of them consuming that much foliage, it really, again, is pretty amazing. And then by the end of that caterpillar stage, they look the more characteristic. They have these 4 pairs of blue dots and then 6 pairs of red dots. The hairs on the caterpillars are irritating to some people and so can cause rashes for people. And it also makes them less palatable for a number of bird species. And we'll talk a little bit about the natural enemies of the gypsy moth in a little bit. And then likely you've seen these empty casings anyway all over your trees. Typically the pupal cases are tucked into little corners, protected areas. You'll often find bunches of them on the underside of branches. And the caterpillars will be in these pupa developing for about 2 weeks. And then they emerge as the adult moths. The top moth here is the female. She's that lighter color with these darker shaped chevrons or V shapes along her wings. She has narrow antennae in contrast to the male that's a darker brown. Again, he does have these V shaped colorations on his wings. And he also has these very feathery antennae, and that's to pick up the pheromones that the female is releasing. And the males can detect that pheromone from up to a mile away. The moths are only alive for about 7 to 10 days, and they don't eat anything while they are in this moth stage. So I mentioned that there's a real cyclical nature to these outbreaks. We will typically have several years of heavy defoliation, and then the population will collapse, and that's usually due to a virus. And then the population will remain low for a number of years until it begins to build again and then erupts out into these huge outbreaks. So in New Hampshire, our outbreaks occur on an average every 7 to 10 years. And because of a fungus that is now in place on the landscape, rather than see region-wide outbreaks, we're tending to see more localized outbreaks, which, unfortunately, this outbreak happens to be localized right over us in the Mount Washington Valley right now. Hopefully in the future, it will mean overall less areas getting hit with this severe defoliation every cycle. So if you find caterpillars sort of dead, hanging in this V shape on the sides of trees, these are caterpillars that have been killed by the nuclear polyhedrosis virus, or NPV virus. This virus exists in the population of gypsy moths normally, but it really doesn't become lethal until we get really high populations of caterpillars. And then for some reason, the stresses of not enough food supply, that sort of thing, the virus becomes lethal, and we start to see the larger caterpillars, or caterpillars in general, dying and forming this V shape stuck to the sides of trees. If you happen to brush up against these caterpillars, you know that this brown gooey stuff oozes out of these caterpillars. Eventually they dry up and look more like the caterpillar over here on the left, and will drop down to the forest floor. And the spores from this virus will then remain in the soil. This is really what we're thinking is somewhat of a game changer for gypsy moth or spongy moth. It's Entomophaga mimega fungus. I'll just call it fungus from this point forward. But if you find caterpillars that are just hanging with their heads face down along trees, these are insects that have been killed by this fungus. This fungus was introduced along with about 40 other different pathogens and parasitoids throughout the last 70 years or so. So this fungus was introduced, I believe it came from Japan. It was introduced around 1910, 1911, and then it was not seen until 1989. Then it started to appear on the landscape, and it's, I think, played a role in keeping keeping these outbreaks smaller and not really region wide. So when we have nice moist conditions, particularly in the spring, that allows the fungus to really build up and infect the caterpillars. They die from the fungus. Once they dry up, they fall to the forest floor. That adds more of those spores back into the soil, and those spores overwinter in the soil. So as long as we have a nice, moist, wet spring, this fungus can help to keep the gypsy moth populations in check. Unfortunately, the last couple of springs have not been our typical wet springs. We've had some really dry springs, and I think that's really what's contributed to us seeing this significant outbreak here. And it's definitely been a factor in states south of us the past few years as well. So the New Hampshire Division of Forests and Lands has been tracking gypsy moth or spongy moth outbreaks over the decades. And so here you can see, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, there were some small infestations, patches. It was really the 1980s. That's when nearly 2.5 million acres in New Hampshire was defoliated by the gypsy moth. That's the year that I really remember being introduced to gypsy moths. 1990s, we didn't have quite as much deforestation, about 600,000 acres. But then you look at the 2000s, now we're starting to see the fungus be established. We've got about 134,000 acres of deforestation, much of it in the southern part of the state in the 2000s. 2010s, only about 9,000 acres in the state defoliated. So we move on to 2001, and each year the state flies the state to look for different defoliating insects and diseases. And you can see 2001, we had about 37,000 acres of deforestation due to the spongy moth, most of it centered right over Carroll County. Unfortunately, I don't have a map for 2022 yet, but they were anticipating that It was probably going to be about 50 to 100,000 acres of defoliation this year. Some of it centered around the Mount Washington Valley again, and they're also starting to see some outbreaks over in the Concord area as well. So I think the real question that a lot of people have are, are my trees going to survive this? And really, tree health and survival are going to be really related to how healthy were your trees before this infestation happened. So, we're looking at a picture of an oak tree here. It's got a very nice full crown, full access to sunlight. Those healthy trees with good, good access to sunlight, good access to water, they'll probably come out of the infestation okay. Those more suppressed trees in the forest that might have been struggling to begin with, that's where we may see some of the decline and potentially mortality as stress factors continue to multiply. Also, plant species is going to influence how severely the trees are defoliated. Again, those oak trees, they're going to be defoliated early in the season. And once a tree is about 50% defoliated, oftentimes these trees will try to re-leaf, set out another set of leaves to continue to try to photosynthesize. Unfortunately, there's a tremendous cost to the tree in terms of the resources it needs to do that reliefing. And sometimes trees will not harden off correctly if they try to relief too late in the season. So some trees you may see not trying to relief, some of those species that maybe were defoliated later in the season. And, we'll just have to wait and see in the spring to see whether those trees do leaf out next year. So what's happening as your tree is defoliated? First year of heavy defoliation, you're likely to see, the tree isn't going to be adding a whole lot of growth, particularly the oaks, the acorns. You're going to see declines in the production of acorns. I think I mentioned earlier, pine, hemlock, and spruce, if those are greater than 50% defoliated, they're much less likely to survive. Because they don't typically lose all of their needles in a given year, but will only lose a portion, trying to come back from a heavy defoliation is just going to take too much energy. With 2 years of heavy defoliation, we're going to see a significant reduction in wood growth. Again, also hard mast, so nuts, beech nuts, acorns, soft mast, berries, cherry species. That's going to have an impact as far as regeneration goes. If you're in a forest situation, they're not going to be producing those seeds for regenerating an area, but it's also going to have an impact for our wildlife that's depending on those food sources. After 2 years of defoliation, again, that's quite a stress, and that's going to leave many trees open for infestation from secondary pests. So things like the armillaria root rot, and in the case of oaks, the two-line chestnut borer that will take advantage of trees in a weakened condition and move into those trees and just add additional stressors. Some of these trees won't die right away. Most of the mortality, though, will happen about within 5 years of when they went through successive defoliation. And then with 3 years of defoliation, you're going to see a higher percentage of mortality, wood growth drastically reduced. In addition to having smaller acorn crops, you're likely to not see these hard mass crops for a number of years as the trees try to recover. And again, we may see changes in forest composition as we have trees dying out. Other trees that are able to produce seed are taking advantage of the sun reaching the forest floor. And so we may see some species change and species coming into the landscape that had a small, were really a smaller component before. So what are some things I can do to protect my trees? For those trees that are in the landscape, you can try placing an inch or two of mulch around the trees, pulling it back a little bit from the trunk so that the mulch isn't right up against the trunk. But that's going to help hold moisture around the root system, and then also add organic matter to where the root system is. Supplemental watering is something else to consider for your shade trees. Normally, mature trees, we don't need to provide water for, but when you think of that idea of all of these accumulating stresses, if you've got trees that are being defoliated by insects, and we've also gone a week without rain and really warm conditions, giving them some supplemental water can help to reduce that lack of moisture stressor. Other thing I would encourage people to do is to monitor, watch for where the defoliation is, look for egg masses, remove those egg masses where possible on your shade trees if you have shade trees that you're really concerned about and have sentimental or significant value on your landscape. You can also use the burlap to create traps, or use sticky tree bands as a means of catching some of the caterpillars. One of the strategies the caterpillars use for dispersing is a technique called ballooning, where they will suspend themselves on silken threads to get caught in the wind and get moved to new locations. And so, the bands will help you reduce the population of caterpillars, but you'll probably likely, still see some defoliation, particularly because as the populations get higher, the caterpillars, and there's more competition for those leaf resources, the caterpillars will stay in the crowns of the trees 24 hours a day. They won't come down to rest. And so you'll be less likely to catch them when they get to those higher populations. And then we'll talk a little bit more about BTK, or Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a chemical that can be used to sprayed to protect your landscape trees. So looking at what does next year's population look like, I think we're still going to see some spotty, heavy defoliation. This is a tree in Bartlett. It's right outside the post office in Bartlett. It's a Norway maple. This is a picture last year. You can see all of the gypsy moth, spongy moth, sorry, adult females laying their eggs. You can see there's some of the males up here, a bunch of the old pupal casings. Saw heavy defoliation. This is that same tree this year. And when I've looked closely at some of these areas that had experienced heavy defoliation, when I look at the egg casings, most of the egg casings that I'm seeing are old. So they're from 2021. So it's going to be interesting to see, in some of these areas, both in Bartlett and in Conway Village, where I've looked at trees that were heavily infested in 2001, I'm not seeing new egg masses. Another thing to think about, did you notice any dead caterpillars hanging from the trees? And did you see a lot of moths this year? I saw a lot of moths at in the summer of 2001, just about everywhere I went in the Mount Washington Valley. This past year, I didn't see as many moths. I know I saw some in Albany when I was actually out on the Tin Mountain property. So I do still expect that there will be some areas that see outbreaks, but hopefully it won't be quite as extensive in some of these areas that have already seen 2 years of defoliation. And then this is just a close-up, and where you see all of these holes in the egg masses, that is a sign that this is an old egg mass, that the caterpillars have already emerged. In some cases, you'll see, places where it looks like black-capped chickadees apparently really will key in and eat the eggs from these egg masses. And there are also some parasitic wasps that will parasitize the eggs. And so when you see all of these holes, that means it's an older egg casing when you're looking at them, say, this winter. So if you have a woodlot, you have a lot of oak on the property, you've had a heavy infestation of spongy moths, one way to try to determine whether you're going to have another bad year of it is to just take a walk into your woodlot, walk out about 500 feet, count the fresh egg masses that you see, turn around, come back on a slightly different path, and again, count the egg masses on your walk back. If the average, if you average that out and it comes out to be around 12, that's going to tell you there are about 250 egg masses per acre and that you can expect some light defoliation. Whereas if you get average counts of about 50 or more, that's telling you there are about 1,000 egg masses per acre. And that's that could indicate more heavy defoliation in the coming year. And so here again, you can see the difference between the older egg mass and the newer one. So if you own a forest property, you've got a lot of oak, you're concerned that some of it is not going to survive. At this point, you don't want to be doing anything in the middle of an infestation. An entry into the forest to remove trees, a timber harvest, is going to put an additional stress on the remaining trees. Things you can think about in the future are doing some sorts of intermediate treatments, thinnings, to allow the crowns of the trees you want to grow to expand and really develop well, and that will give them more, a better chance at being resilient to defoliation in the future. Really, the best thing you can do is try to keep your trees healthy. Diversity is good as well. Typically, we get diversity in our forests, but want to avoid developing these pure stands of oak. Keeping a good species mix will help, and keeping those trees healthy. I will note that there are some natural enemies to the gypsy moths, spongy moths. There's some ground beetles, stink bugs that will eat the caterpillars. I mentioned the parasitic wasp. There's an image of it down here in the center. This was one of the species, parasitoids, that was introduced here to try to control gypsy moth. I think they introduced about 40 different species, and about 8 of them have remained on the landscape, and some of them are helpful in controlling populations. Mice and shrews will eat the caterpillars, also eat the pupa. Most birds will eat gypsy moths sort of as an occasional part of their diet. The hares, just like they can irritate people, do irritate the birds, with the exception of a few species that include the yellow-billed cuckoo and the black-billed cuckoo. Apparently, when they eat these moths, the hairs get stuck in the lining of their stomach, and they're able to regurgitate them out, much like an owl does with an owl pellet. So their numbers will increase when we have these gypsy moth infestations. And Bacillus thuringiensis kerstaki. That is a biological pesticide. It's actually a bacterium, and it's specific to Lepidoptera species, so butterfly and moth species. This has been developed into a spray, and you can use that as a spray to kill the caterpillars on your trees. It's really important to apply it early in the season, though, just after the eggs hatch, once they get to be a ½ inch or so, that bacterium is not going to be effective. So another way to figure this out, are they too big already, is when the caterpillars are little, they have a head capsule that is entirely black. And as they get older, that they get more yellow on it. Once you start to see yellow on the head capsule, this application will not really be effective. The benefit of using this type of bacterium is that it does only affect Lepidoptera species, and it's only going to affect those species that are in the caterpillar stage at the same time the gypsy moth is. And then here's just another view of the defoliation from this past year. Again, you can see on these upper drier slopes where, again, oak is a component, heavy deforestation or defoliation here, not deforestation. So I have a couple of more insects to introduce you to, but I thought I might stop here and see if people have questions specific to the spongy moth. So I will stop sharing my screen now and then start up again.
Okay, great. Wendy, I have 2 questions for you.
Okay.
And if other folks have questions, as I said, you can either type them into the chat feature or momentarily you can unmute yourself. My first question was, I've heard of the BTK, but I had also heard of someone locally using diatomaceous earth for like basically coating their apple trees in them. Have you heard anything about that as a use for for deterrent?
No, that's an interesting idea though, because I think the idea of it is like with slugs, that it will penetrate their bodies and cause injury, which will then lead them to be more susceptible to other disease. So, if I'd be interested in hearing how that works, if they had success with that, because in all of the materials I've read, I have not heard about that specific approach, but it's definitely, if you've got the diatomaceous earth, particularly in orchard, you're trying to avoid using any sorts of chemicals. So I'd say it's worth a try.
And then a couple of questions that came in. So scraping the cocoons off, now or in the spring, does that have any effect, on the population and outbreak?
It will have a little. I don't know how much effect it will have. I mean, I think it will definitely make you feel better. I know I do that with Japanese beetles, and I drop them into soapy water and I feel really good. It may not help my plants at all, but personally I feel better. So I would say, when they reach that real outbreak stage, so many of them, are going to be up higher than you can get. You may reduce the populations a little, but there's also a hope that, again, with some of these wasps and that sort of thing, that hopefully some of those egg masses are going to be parasitized as well. So real outbreak year, you're probably not going to be able to access a lot of them, but it doesn't hurt to knock them off into soapy water.
Okay. And there's a question about the aerial photograph that you showed just a moment ago. I think of the Green Hills area and the defoliation. And the question is, did those trees leaf back out?
I can't answer for those trees specifically. I know I stopped the other day to look at a stand of trees that had been defoliated along Route 302. And I did see some trees made some effort to refoliate, others did not. And I don't know whether some of that is related to they just didn't have the energy to refoliate, or whether it related to they were completely defoliated or over 50% defoliated later in the season. And, you know, somehow, I don't know how trees make decisions, but made the decision not to try to refoliate. So, you know, I've seen a lot of trees that were heavily impacted try to put out some more leaves, but what I'm seeing is it's not a whole new full set of leaves. They're, you know, stunted. It's not a complete refoliation.
Okay, and along those lines of defoliation, there's a question here specifically about hemlocks, but I may just expand it to the softwoods and conifers that got hit really hard, and that is for those you know, for the conifers that got pretty completely defoliated. What are the chances that those trees that aren't used to losing all their, you know, all their leaves, all their needles at once will recover?
Yeah, I would say if they've lost more than 50% of their needles, they're likely not going to survive for more than a couple of years. They may hang on for a couple of years, but I think you'll see them decline over time, just as it takes so much energy to, you know, each year be growing out some new needles, and yet they don't have the needles that they really need to be growing the new set. You know, typically I will talk about when I meet with people and talk about tree health, you know, anywhere from a half the total tree height to 1/3 of the total tree height. You know, a healthy tree is going to have, you know, either half of its full height or up to 1/3 of its full tree height in growing green canopy. And so if your tree has lost, you know, more than 50% of its canopy as an evergreen, chances are it's going to really struggle.
Okay, Russ, I might need you to
okay, you hear me?
yes, we can hear you. So Russ had a question on adventitious limbs on oaks.
I've noticed, I've been watching these defoliations since the late 60s, and I've noticed that a lot of the oaks seem to develop adventitious wood growth, while some of the original limbs die. It just seems like it's sort of oxymoronic for a tree to be doing that rather than, but is there a logical reason for this? Or am I up the wrong tree?
Yeah, no, there is a logical reason for it, and it's called epicormic sprouting, actually.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, and so what happens is when trees get under stress, and they're exposed to sunlight, particularly oaks are very particular about this. You know, if they're under stress and you get more sunlight reaching the bole of the tree, there are these latent buds just underneath the bark, and they will sprout. And so that has an impact as far as timber quality goes, because you now have a knot where you didn't have a knot before. And oftentimes when these appear on the lower bole of the tree, that's really where, you know, your value for your wood is. So it's a sign that you've got a lot of sunlight reaching the bole of that tree. It's under stress, and so it's responding by having those latent buds start to grow.
What's that called again?
Epicormic sprouting.
Oh.
And so when we do timber harvesting, one of the things we try to do if we're leaving oak trees, because we want them to regenerate and continue to grow and produce acorns, is we try to leave shade on the bole of the tree on the south side so that they don't develop those epicormic sprouts. Probably more than you wanted to know. But
No, but it's very intriguing.
All right, Wendy, I'm going to ask you one more question and then about this, and then I'll have you keep going with
Okay.
things to scare and worry us about.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you some more things.
And this one is more of just a logistics question, and that is for those of us who are, who are going to scrape egg masses, or, I had a friend who would take a paint scraper to the side of her house to take the
Yep.
To take the caterpillars off every afternoon. What does one do with the bucket full of, soapy, masses? I guess particularly with the masses, is there a duration that they need to be saturated so that they are not going to
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to how long you need to do that. But I would say if you, dump them in a hole and dump some water, dump some more dirt over them, you could, just sort of bury them that way. They are, going to be organic material. But I would probably leave them that way for, I would say, 24, 48 hours.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think I may have even read 72 hours in.
Okay, yeah.
Keep them in a solution for 72 hours to really ensure that they're killed. But okay,
They're not viable. Yeah.
I'm gonna mute myself again, and I will let you yes, keep on with some of our other invasives.
Okay, yeah, well, I will introduce you to two more. Oh, no, I need to do that. Okay. Are you seeing the slideshow again?
Yes, we are back to seeing the aerial.
All of the defoliation.
Yeah.
Okay. So another insect I just want to make people aware of, and you may have heard of this one. There's been talk of it for a long time, but it's creeping further north now, which is unfortunate. It's the hemlock woolly adelgid. This insect is native to China and Japan. It came into Virginia around 1950 and has really spread throughout much of the range of hemlock in the East. It's really been devastating to native hemlock forests down south, Connecticut, Virginia, North Carolina. It was found in New Hampshire in the year 2000 in Portsmouth. And fortunately, because of our cold winters, here it takes somewhere between 4 and 10 years to actually kill trees, where further south it can kill trees in fewer years. But it's still something to watch for. The insect itself is a tiny little insect that covers itself with this cottony or wool-like coating, which gives it the woolly adelgid name. It has piercing mouth parts and you find these cottony masses right along the stems of twigs, right by the base of needles. And so they, with their piercing mouth parts, they pierce into that twig tissue and pull out all of the nutrients of the tree and eventually, cause those branches, those needles to die. Here you can see a map of towns with known infestations of the I'm still talking gypsy moth, of the hemlock woolly adelgid. And this past year, we did find infestations in both Conway and in Jackson. Before then, really the furthest north I was finding it was right on the eastern edge of Lake Winnipesaukee. It spread a lot by birds and rodents. That wool-like covering is kind of sticky. And so birds will get it on their feet. And then as they're, traveling north and south, often following water corridors and lakes, they'll land on hemlock trees and can start new populations. So populations of this insect tend to be spotty, but I've seen real increases in Wolfboro, Tuftonboro, Moultonboro over the last few years because we haven't had those really cold snaps during the winter that can really kill a lot of these adelgids off and really knock the population down. So we are seeing this further north. This is some examples of damage in more to the south of us, Connecticut, again, Virginia, North Carolina, you can see the trees sort of, the crowns get thinner, they get this grayish tinge to them, and then they eventually die. And, you know, the sad thing about that is hemlock is a wonderful wildlife tree. It provides great cover for all sorts of bird species, as well as providing important deer wintering cover. There are things you can do to control the hemlock woolly adelgid on your landscape trees. And so what I'd really just encourage people to do is, as you're walking through the forest, you know, flip those hemlock branches over, look for signs of that woolly coating. You know, and if you do find hemlock woolly adelgid, we've got great resources that you can use to figure out, you know, if it's a landscape tree and it's really something you want to save. There are treatments, that basal bark treatments, as well as soil treatments, that can be used to help knock those populations back if we don't get those cold winters to do that for us. The other insect that I just wanted people to be aware of, we're seeing a lot of it in Southern Carroll County now, and actually found it in Albany and Conway this past year, is the emerald ash borer. And again, this is a non-native insect. It was first found in the United States in 2002. It was found in the Detroit, Michigan area. And since that time, it has spread all the way east to Maine. And it can kill ash trees within 3 to 5 years. And it's all species of true ash, which here include white, black, and green ash. So it doesn't affect our mountain ash, but it affects these other ash species. It's killed millions of ash trees, and for a while we were trying to slow the spread of the insect. We still have out-of-state firewood bans for that purpose, because a lot of part of the reason this insect moved so fast, so fast was because people were moving firewood around that had these insects in it, and then they would escape into new areas and start new populations. So at this point, eradication is not an option. The state has been releasing parasitic wasps that parasitize both the larva and the eggs. And so we hope after this killing front sort of goes through, that we will be able to, the insects can't really survive in small ash trees. So we're hoping that there will be enough of a population of ash that will be able to reestablish it on the landscape if we can get some of these biological controls working. The damage really comes from these bright green insects. They lay their eggs on the bark of the ash tree. The egg hatches, and then they create these galleries right in the conductive tissue of the tree just under the bark. And when you get enough of them doing that, they effectively girdle the tree and kill it. So here's a map showing where that's been found. In New Hampshire, the first thing that you're going to see likely is going to be what we call blonding. And ash trees have this dark gray bark to them. But the woodpeckers can sense when there are a lot of these larvae feeding just underneath the bark. And so they will go and start drilling holes in there to get to the larva. And in the process, they chip off the bark, that outer bark, and they leave this lighter blonde color bark. That's really distinctive of them feeding on these larvae. So, so that's what to look for on ash trees. And again, if you have important landscape trees, there are chemical controls that can be used. There are injections into the trees, as well as soil drenches that can be used to protect important yard trees. So if you do have ash trees that you really like in your yard, and you're in an area that is close to an infestation area, you want to think about getting those trees chemically treated while they're still healthy, because they need to be somewhat healthy to be able to move that chemical around and kill the insects that are feeding on them. And the last thing that I'll just mention is we have a site that is run by UNH Cooperative Extension and the New Hampshire Division of Forest and Lands called nhbugs.org. And you can find lots of information about all sorts of fun and exciting insects and diseases that affect our trees at that website. Also, if you find an insect, you don't know what it is, you're concerned about it. Oops, let me go back. I'm trying to scroll on a page I can't scroll on. There's a tab on this website for reporting a suspect tree or insect. You can also feel free to send me a picture if you find an insect and you're concerned about it, or you can upload it to this website, and somebody from Extension or the Division of Forest and Lands will get back to you. But a lot of great information here on all of these different pests. And so with that, again, I'll open things up to questions. Okay.
Wendy, thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Again, I'll encourage folks to to use the chat feature, or momentarily you can unmute yourself. I do have a question that I think, particularly for the Mount Washington Valley in this area is more probably related to the spongy moths, but certainly could encompass any outbreak that causes die-off of trees. But thinking about the estimation of 50 to 100,000 acres of defoliation, a number of these trees for the second time. Is there a concern that that areas, particularly of the White Mountain National Forest, that they're going to have these large swaths of dead wood hanging, dead wood there that may cause fire or other concerns?
That's a really good question. I think primarily we're seeing the infestation, the gypsy moth infestation, in stands that have a relatively high component of oak. So once we get into the White Mountain National Forest, we start to transition more into our northern hardwoods. So that's your beech, birch, and maple. So I think there are less concerns there, just because the species aren't as conducive as further south, where we have more of an oak pine forest cover type. Also, I think, some research shows that with a couple of years of deforestation, defoliation, we can be looking at, somewhere around 6 to 8% mortality of the oak that's defoliated. So, there's still going to be a lot of trees, again, trees that went into this healthy that are going to come out okay. So there's definitely the potential for there to be, some dead snags that could create extra woodpecker habitat, that sort of thing. But I don't think we're going to see, areas that have a widespread slash problem that would be a concern for wildfire.
Okay, and you said that the average is that it's about 6 to 8% mortality with these.
I've seen different studies, and so I'm a little hesitant on, that's the low end of it, but that's the closest to here research that I've seen. So, you could on some, really dry sites that have suffered drought for a few years, then got hit with the spongy moth, see higher levels, but I don't think we're going to see a widespread mass mortality event.
Okay. So we have a question, since we're talking about spongy moths and scary moths. So one that, there's a question about the brown moths. I think this is brown-tailed moth.
Brown-tailed moth, yeah.
And if that is a species, if that's a species of concern around here, and I guess I have a follow-up question, is that an invasive? Is the brown-tailed moth considered an invasive?
I think it may be considered invasive. I'm not really sure. I believe the populations that exist of it are in coastal Maine and are relatively small populations of it. I have not heard of any brown-tailed moth infestation up this way, but again, that's something that I know the hairs of that moth can cause real respiratory problems for some people. So that is something to watch for. I have not heard of anything other than a few communities in coastal Maine that have issues with that particular insect.
Right, I was to say, I know it's very localized. And so there was a question, and again about a follow-up on the brown-tailed moth, and I know because it's not something we have around here, it's probably not something you're well versed in, but but I think it gets to a good point that some of the deterrent and trapping, I know we see this with Japanese beetles as well, are the pheromone traps. And so is there any use of pheromone traps for spongy moths?
I believe the pheromone traps can be useful for monitoring. They don't really have an effect in terms of lowering the population because they draw the males in, but there's still so many other males out there that it really doesn't have an impact. I mean, it's not a way to bring the population down, but it is a good monitoring tool. And I know we've used we had those purple prism traps that we used for monitoring for emerald ash borer. And I think, it's good to have some of those tools to be monitoring for some of these other insects that are near us that we'd like to eradicate if we can find a population early enough. So,
okay, and I guess another piece of this is for I know you talked about sort of landscape trees that are important for people that have like a trees of commercial importance, like apple, like apple orchards, thinking about the spongy moth, what would be if the trees, I mean, I guess there's two scenarios. If the trees are healthy, but we're in an area where there have been outbreaks, what would be encouraged for preventative measures, and then I guess if you're if you are seeing if you're seeing those cocoons on apple trees, what what your recommendations would be for salvaging those trees.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be a case where, often they are, they're dwarf trees, so it would be easier to get to some of those egg masses. And so, I would say the bands, the scraping the egg masses, those would all be good efforts to undertake. I don't know with regard to organic, whether that BT falls under that category. I know that there are formations of BT that are used on crops that people eat. So if it's a commercial orchard or something like that, I would look into, the impacts, the potential impacts of that as a treatment, and whether that fits with the rest of your management of the orchard.
Yes, and I will say, and it was, and as I said, I don't have more information, but it was an orchard that was a family using the diatomaceous earth on their, on the apple trees. And I'll have to go back and check how successful.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in that, because I like that idea of using the least toxic means of, controlling these sorts of outbreaks.
Mhm. I do think it made it look like a ghost orchard, though.
Doubles as a haunted house place, sort of.
Yes,
thing.
yeah, yeah. So if it doesn't, work out, yes, you can always as a haunted orchard. Do folks have any other questions for Wendy? I just sort of I think I just hit the last one that came in through the chat. So if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask anything directly. So this was the comment that the Coastal Maine Botanic Gardens uses neem oil and large and large tarps to gather up brown-tailed moth larvae. Yeah, so I don't know if
Okay, interesting.
how neem might be, but if anyone wants to
I believe you can also use horticultural oils for the spongy moth, but you need to get really good coverage, and you may be able to do that with an apple orchard as well. And smother those egg masses. I don't have a pesticide applicator's license, so I should make that clear that I can't really make those recommendations, and any pesticide, I encourage you to follow the directions and make sure that it's a registered product here in New Hampshire, all of that. That's my disclaimer.
All right. Thank you, Wendy. Does anyone have any additional questions? Didn't know I saw one or two of you unmuted. Well, with that,
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording. But Wendy, thank you so much for your time and all this information.
Sure.
Hopefully it brings, it gives a little bit of hope to some people that their, properties got hit hard. And again, a special thanks to Friends of the Whitney Community Community Center in Jackson for their support of this program, as well as our nature program series sponsors, White Mountain Oil and Propane, Ragged Mountain Equipment, and Hancock Lumber.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you.